The echo of boots on the marble hallway sounded like the prelude to a storm. It was early on an October morning, and the first rays of sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the military academy, creating golden stripes across the immaculate floor. In the central auditorium, rows of leather chairs awaited the officers who would soon arrive for a presentation that apparently would be just another one among many. But there was something in the air, an invisible tension, like the moment of silence before the first shot is fired. Major Helen Montgomery adjusted the last button of her impeccable uniform and took a deep breath. 20 years of service had taught her that not every battle takes place on warfields. Some of the fiercest occur in climate-controlled rooms, where the weapons are words and the projectiles glances. She knew this morning would be no different. Her fingers, marked by small scars from past operations, held firmly the leather portfolio containing meticulously organized reports. Each page represented hours of work, lives saved, missions accomplished with surgical precision. Helen wasn't a woman easily intimidated. Her eyes, a deep brown like wet earth, carried the serenity of someone who had already faced the unimaginable. Her upright posture and determined steps revealed an inner strength forged in years of intense training, sleepless nights planning operations, and moments where the difference between life and death depended on her leadership. But that morning, as she walked through the familiar corridors of the academy, she felt a different unease. Not the fear of physical combat, but the fatigue of a more subtle and persistent war. The first officers began to arrive at the auditorium, their low conversations mingling with the sound of footsteps and chairs being dragged. Helen observed from afar, noticing the small groups that formed, the expressions that changed when her name was mentioned. She had risen rapidly through the military ranks, faster than many expected, faster than some considered appropriate. Her competence was undeniable, her results impressive. But to some of the older officers, especially those whose careers had developed in a different era, Helen represented an uncomfortable break with traditions they considered sacred. The auditorium began to fill. Helen recognized many faces, some allies, others neutral, some clearly hostile. In the front row, retired General Richard Miller took his seat with the pomp of someone who still believed his opinion carried the weight of a military order. A man of graying hair and a neatly trimmed mustache, Miller had retired 5 years earlier, but still frequented academy events as if he were an oracle of military wisdom. His comments about the worrying changes in the military were well known in more conservative circles. When Helen was called to the stage, the murmur of the audience gradually subsided. She walked with firm steps to the lectern, her heels sounding with metronomic precision on the wooden floor. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful silence of attention, but something denser, charged with expectation, and in some corners, with barely concealed skepticism. Helen began her presentation with the same clarity and objectivity that characterized all her official communications. Her voice, neither loud nor low, but perfectly audible, filled the space with precise information about Operation Green Cerrado, a highly classified rescue mission that had been completed 3 months earlier. The images projected on the screen behind her showed detailed maps, execution timelines, and statistics that spoke for themselves. 14 soldiers rescued in hostile territory, 0 casualties from the rescue force, operation completed in 72 hours. The numbers were impressive, but Helen knew that numbers, however eloquent, were not always enough to convince closed hearts. She had learned over the years that prejudice is like armor. The denser it is, the harder it is to penetrate with logic and facts. Even so, she continued methodically, presenting each aspect of the operation with the precision of a surgeon explaining a complex procedure. It was when she was describing the most critical phase of the mission, the negotiation with local rebel groups to ensure safe passage, that the first comment cut through the air like a knife. General Miller, without even waiting for a natural pause in the presentation, leaned slightly forward and said, in a tone loud enough to be heard by the entire front row, "It's impressive to see how rhetoric has replaced practice. I bet it was easier to command this operation from a beauty salon than from the battlefield." The comment was followed by muffled laughter that spread through the audience like ripples in a pond. They weren't loud or obviously disrespectful guffaws. They were contained chuckles, the kind that allows for plausible deniability if anyone questions their appropriateness. But Helen heard them clearly, each one like a small stab at her professional dignity. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. Helen stopped mid-sentence, her hands still pointing to the chart on the screen behind her. She could feel the blood pulsing in her temples. She could hear the echo of the comment reverberating in her mind. 20 years of service, dozens of successful operations, lives saved, risks taken, all reduced to a joke about a beauty salon. But Helen Montgomery hadn't gotten where she was by reacting impulsively to provocations. She took a deep breath, allowing the silence to stretch for a few seconds longer than would be comfortable for the audience. When she finally spoke, her voice maintained the same professional calm as before. But there was something new in it, a sharp quality, like tempered steel. "From what I see," she said, her eyes sweeping across the auditorium without haste, "misogyny is more resistant than any enemy I've ever faced in combat." The response landed like a bolt from the blue. The murmur that had accompanied the earlier laughter died instantly. Some officers shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable with the sudden tension that gripped the room. Others, especially the younger ones, seemed torn between admiration for Helen's courage and apprehension about the consequences of such a direct confrontation. Colonel Baker, seated in the third row, cleared his throat loudly and muttered something about female theatrics to the officer beside him. The comment was made in a low tone, but in an auditorium where silence had become almost palpable, the words carried further than he probably intended. Other voices joined in disapproving murmurs, side comments, that created a symphony of disrespect disguised as civility. Helen felt each word like a stone being thrown at her. Not because they hurt, she had developed emotional armor over the years, but because they represented something far greater than personal insults. They represented decades of women being diminished, discredited, forced to prove their worth repeatedly, while their male colleagues had their competence assumed as the standard. She continued her presentation, determined not to give her detractors the satisfaction of seeing her waver. Each subsequent slide was presented with even greater precision, each statistic explained with crystal clarity. But the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The whispered comments continued, like the persistent buzzing of irritating insects. Helen could see the disrespect in the faces of some officers, the malicious amusement in the eyes of those who saw her presentation not as a professional military report, but as entertainment. It was at this moment of highest tension that the double doors at the back of the auditorium opened with a sound that cut through the air like an axe. The sound of boots echoing from that point was unlike any other in the auditorium. They weren't the quick, nervous steps of a latecomer, nor the measured steps of an officer observing protocol. They were the steps of someone who walks with the natural authority of one who has never needed to prove their worth because it was universally recognized. Everyone turned, and a different silence fell over the auditorium, no longer the tense silence of embarrassment, but the automatic silence of respect. Walking down the central aisle with a presence that filled the space far beyond his physical stature was Colonel Arthur Vance. Vance was a living legend in the institution, known as the Lion of the Savannah, since a heroic operation where he had led a group of soldiers through hostile territory for 5 days, losing only one man out of a battalion of 50. He bore decorations that told stories of courage that most officers had only heard in lectures on military tactics. His physical presence, broad shoulders, impeccable posture, blue eyes that seemed to see through people, was impressive, but it was his history that commanded instant respect even from the most skeptical. Vance had retired from active duty 2 years earlier, but remained as a strategic consultant to the Academy. His opinions were sought only on the most complex issues. His recommendations followed almost as orders. More importantly, he was known for his absolute integrity, and for never allowing political or personal considerations to interfere with his professional judgment. As he walked through the auditorium, his eyes scanned the audience with an expression that didn't reveal his intentions. Some officers instinctively straightened in their chairs, others avoided his gaze. General Miller, who moments before had worn a smile of malicious satisfaction, now seemed suddenly interested in examining his own shoes. Vance stopped right in the center of the auditorium, positioning himself so that he could be clearly seen by the entire audience. The silence was now absolute, not even the sound of breathing seemed audible. Helen, still standing at the lectern, watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She knew Vance by reputation, of course, but had never directly interacted with him. When Vance finally spoke, his voice carried a natural authority that made each word sound as if it were being etched in stone. "Gentlemen," he began, and the simple way he pronounced that word made every person in the auditorium know that something significant was about to happen. Now, imagine if you could receive stories like this regularly, narratives that not only entertain but that touch your soul and make you reflect on fundamental values like dignity, respect, and courage. If you are enjoying this journey of Major Helen Montgomery, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. That way, you'll be the first to receive each new story we carefully create, stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit, that show how small gestures can transform entire lives, and that remind us that true heroes exist around us every day. Your subscription not only ensures that you don't miss any of these powerful narratives, but also encourages us to continue creating content that uplifts and inspires. Because in a world that sometimes seems cold and disconnected, we all need reminders that humanity, respect, and dignity still prevail. I have just witnessed one of the most brilliant presentations this institution has ever received. Vance continued, his voice echoing clearly throughout the auditorium. Each word was pronounced with careful deliberation, as if he were building a legal argument before a Supreme Court. "Those who dare to disrespect this woman disrespect not only the honor of our army, but the sacrifice of everyone who wears this uniform, including mine." The pause that followed seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Helen could feel her heart beating faster, not from nervousness, but from an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Was it relief, gratitude, vindication? Perhaps it was a mixture of all of these, seasoned with the surprise of seeing someone of such moral stature take her defense so categorically and publicly. Colonel Vance continued, and his next words would transform not only the atmosphere of that morning, but potentially Helen's career and many people's perception of what military leadership meant. "Major Montgomery commanded an operation that saved 14 soldiers trapped in a hostile conflict zone. While you were in air-conditioned rooms, she faced landmines, negotiations with armed rebels, and the fear of death, and she won." Vance's words weren't just a defense, they were an education. Each sentence painted a stark contrast between those who judged from the comfort of their secure positions and the one who had literally risked her life for her soldiers. Helen remembered those 3 days in Operation Green Cerrado, the stifling heat, the constant tension, the split-second decisions that could mean life or death for 14 Brazilian families. She had coordinated the rescue operation from an outpost where Brazilian soldiers were surrounded by local rebel groups. The situation was politically complex. They couldn't simply attack, as that would violate international agreements and potentially cause a major diplomatic incident. Helen had spent hours negotiating with rebel leaders, using a combination of diplomacy, psychological intimidation, and carefully calibrated promises to create a safe corridor for the withdrawal. During these negotiations, she had walked through literal and figurative minefields, knowing that one wrong step could not only cost her own life, but also the lives of all the soldiers under her command. She had slept 4 hours in 3 days, eaten cold rations, and drunk water that needed to be purified with chlorine tablets. Her feet were covered in blisters, her hands scratched by branches and barbed wire, her uniform soaked with sweat and dirt. But none of that mattered when, on the third day, she had managed to negotiate the safe release of all 14 soldiers without firing a single shot. The operation had been a perfect example of how strategic intelligence, skillful diplomacy, and competent leadership could achieve what brute force could not. It had undoubtedly been one of the proudest moments of her career. Now Vance was telling this story to an audience that had reduced Helen to jokes about beauty salons. The contrast was so stark, so powerful, that Helen could see the discomfort spreading across the faces in the audience like a wave. Vance's next move was even more impactful. He turned to Helen, raised his right hand in a perfect salute, rigid, precise, held for the exact protocolar time, and said, "Authorized to conduct advanced tactical training in my battalion, effective immediately. We have much to learn from her." Vance's salute wasn't just a protocolar military gesture of respect, it was a symbol. It was a decorated colonel, an institutional legend, paying public homage to a major who had been ridiculed moments before. It was an unequivocal statement that competence and courage have no gender, that true leadership manifests itself in actions, not in appearances or conformity to traditional expectations. Helen returned the salute with the same precision, but inside her was a storm of emotions. She had spent years proving her worth, years facing doubts and suspicions, years being measured by different standards than those applied to her male colleagues. And now, at this moment, before an audience that had questioned her competence, one of the most respected officers in the institution was not only validating her worth, but elevating her as an example to be followed. The impact on those present was visible and immediate. General Miller, who minutes before had made disparaging remarks, now stared intently at his own hands, his face red with embarrassment. Colonel Baker seemed to have shrunk in his chair, as if he wanted to become invisible. Other officers looked alternately at Helen, at Vance, and anywhere but into the eyes of their colleagues. But the most significant thing wasn't the embarrassment of the detractors, it was the visible transformation on other faces. Young officers who had witnessed the disrespect with silent discomfort now seemed inspired. Some veterans, who had remained neutral during the previous comments, now displayed clear expressions of approval. Women in the audience, few, but significant, seemed to straighten up in their chairs, as if Helen's defense was also a validation of their own struggles and achievements. Vance didn't need to say anything more. His message had been conveyed with absolute clarity. He gave a brief nod to Helen, another to the audience, and walked back down the center aisle, with the same commanding presence with which he had entered. But the audience he left was fundamentally different from the one he had entered. Helen resumed her presentation, but now the atmosphere had completely changed. There were no more disrespectful murmurs, no more malicious laughter. The audience was paying genuine attention to what she was saying, asking relevant technical questions, engaging with the content of her presentation, instead of looking for ways to diminish her. When Helen concluded her presentation 20 minutes later, the reaction was respectful applause, not the polite, obligatory applause given to fulfill protocol, but the genuine recognition of a well-done presentation by a competent professional. Some officers approached her afterward to ask more detailed questions about specific aspects of the operation. Others simply made respectful eye contact and nodded in acknowledgement. But perhaps the most significant moment happened when Helen was packing up her materials. General Miller approached her, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to speak. "Major," he said, his voice low and hesitant, I would like to apologize for my previous comments. They were inappropriate and do not reflect the respect your career deserves." Helen looked at him for a moment, seeing not malice, but genuine shame in his eyes. "Thank you, General," she replied simply. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them." After her presentation, Helen Montgomery walked the halls of the military academy, reflecting on what had transpired. Colonel Vance's intervention had been powerful, not because he had humiliated her detractors or used his authority to silence criticism. It had been powerful because he had simply spoken the truth about Helen's competence, the truth about her accomplishments, the truth about what truly mattered in evaluating a military officer. Vance hadn't needed to raise his voice or issue threats. He had simply used his moral credibility to illuminate a reality some had chosen to ignore. He had shown that recognizing merit diminishes no one. In fact, it elevates everyone. He had demonstrated that true leadership sometimes means defending those who are unjustly attacked, even when it would be easier to remain silent. Word of what happened in that auditorium spread rapidly through the academy, but not in the way Helen initially feared. It didn't become a story about confrontation or division, but about a moment when fundamental values were reaffirmed. It became a story about how a gesture of justice can transform not just a moment, but the culture of an entire institution. In the weeks that followed, Helen noticed subtle but significant changes in how she was treated, not because people feared Vance or his repercussions, but because they had been reminded of something many already knew, but had allowed to be obscured by prejudice, that competence is competence, regardless of who possesses it. Vance's invitation to lead tactical training hadn't been mere rhetoric. Helen began working with his battalion 2 weeks later, developing new negotiation and rescue protocols that incorporated lessons learned in Operation Green Cerrado. The soldiers under her command, initially skeptical, as expected, quickly recognized her expertise and leadership. Months later, when Helen was promoted to lieutenant colonel, Vance was present at the ceremony. During the reception that followed, he approached her with a rare smile. "You know," he said, "that day in the auditorium wasn't about defending you. It was about defending the truth, and the truth has a way of winning, eventually." Helen smiled back. "Thank you, Colonel, for seeing the truth when others chose not to." "Don't thank me for doing what was right," Vance replied. "Thank yourself for being the kind of officer who makes doing what's right easy." Years later, when Helen became a general, the first woman to achieve that rank in her division, she kept a photo on her desk, a picture from her lieutenant colonel promotion ceremony, where Vance was present, but it wasn't the photo that mattered to her. It was the memory of what it represented, a moment when someone had chosen courage over convenience, truth over tradition, justice over the status quo. Helen never forgot the lesson of that day, that sometimes the most important moments of our careers are not determined by our own actions, but by the willingness of others to recognize and defend those actions. That true leadership sometimes means being a shield for others, even when it means exposing oneself to criticism or personal discomfort. When young female officers came to her seeking guidance on how to deal with disrespect or discrimination, Helen always told the story of Colonel Vance, not to suggest that they needed saviors, but to remind them that allies exist, that people of integrity recognize competence regardless of its packaging, and that moments of injustice are also opportunities for people of character to reveal themselves. "The world is full of people hoping you'll fail," she would tell these young officers, "but it's also full of people hoping you'll succeed. Your job is to be so competent that the former have no choice but to acknowledge your worth, and so upright that the latter will be proud to defend you." The story of Helen Montgomery and Colonel Arthur Vance became part of the military academy's folklore, told not as a story about gender or politics, but as a story about character, about a moment
when dignity was restored not through confrontation or revenge, but through the simple and powerful recognition of truth. Vance retired completely 2 years later, but his legacy remained not only in the operations he had led, or the battles he had won, but in that quiet moment, in an auditorium, when he had chosen to stand on the side of justice. Helen continued her upward career trajectory, breaking barriers and setting new standards of excellence, but she never forgot that sometimes the most important victories are won, not by ourselves, but by those who choose to see us as we truly are. And in a world where disrespect can be loud and injustice can be boisterous, sometimes it's the quiet power of truth, championed by people of unwavering character, that echoes loudest and longest. True heroism, after all, rarely comes with fanfare. More often, it arrives in the sound of boots marching steadily toward what is right, followed by the powerful silence of those who recognize that they have witnessed something truly meaningful.